He says the following: the reason for this, in other words, the reason for why not as many people were involved in the Trojan expedition as the expeditions of Thucydides' day, was not so much a shortage of men as shortage of means. Because of their lack of supplies, they took quite a modest army, limited to the size they thought could live off the land while on active duty. And after they had won a battle upon arrival, as they clearly did, otherwise they could not have fortified their camp, even then they evidently did not exploit their power to the full, but through their lack of provisions got diverted into farming the Chersonese and into plunder. And with the Greek forces split this way, the Trojans were able to resist them in battle for 10 years, since they, in other words, the Trojans, were a match for whatever forces remained behind. In other words, the Trojans were able to fend off whatever amount of Greeks remained who weren't either farming or off plundering. However, if the Greeks had come with additional supplies at the outset and had applied their whole force to the war continuously without resorting to plunder and farming, they would easily have prevailed in battle and captured Troy, since even with less than their full force, they held the Trojans off with whatever part of the army was to hand. And if they had been able to settle down to a siege, they would have taken Troy in less time and with less effort. But instead, just as a lack of resources led to the weakness of previous expeditions, so this particular expedition, despite its great celebrity, and certainly the fact that there was great celebrity is to be indicative of some sort of critique of Homer, but despite its great celebrity, demonstrably fell well short of its reputation and of the received tradition derived from the poets. And yes, right there in the end of that sentence, he makes perfectly clear that he's taken a shot at Homer. But notice it's not just a shot at Homer. It's the entire tradition because of how successful Homer had been. And for Thucydides, what that means is because of how hyperbolic Homer had been. And as we've seen, Thucydides is here to bring a very clear-eyed view to his claim that the old is not so great. And again, precisely because the old did not have the techne, the technology, that the new has. And the new, to repeat, for Thucydides, is this thing called Greekness that's building up and to be distinguished from barbarism. And we know that it's still building up because Thucydides is about to tell us in paragraph 12 that the great motions of the Trojan War did not cease. In other words, they did not lead to peace, which is to say rest. And in Thucydides' account, what that means is that the universal motions, the stasis, from the earliest times of Greece were still ongoing despite the Trojan War. And that's to say that barbarism was still ongoing despite the Trojan War. And so that brings us to paragraph 12. Thucydides says the following: of course, even after the Trojan War, Greece was still undergoing population changes and settlement, so there was no period of peaceful development. The long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy caused great political turmoil, and there was widespread civil strife in cities, causing the departure of exiles who founded new cities. For example, the present-day Boeotians were driven out of Arne by the Thessalians in the 60th year after the fall of Troy, and settled the land that was once called Cadmeus and is now Boeotia. A proportion of them was settled in that land earlier, and it was some of these who went on the expedition against Troy. And in the 80th year after the fall of Troy, the Dorians and the Heraclidae occupied the Peloponnese. After a long course of time, Greece emerged from her difficulties to enjoy a period of peace and security with a stable population. They then started to send out colonies, the Athenians colonizing Ionia and the majority of the islands, the Peloponnesians most of Italy and Sicily, and some places in the rest of Greece. And all of these colonies were founded after the Trojan War. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind in this paragraph, and the first concerns the long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy. Because remember, the previous paragraph contained a powerful critique of Homer, which is to say the greatness of Homer's Greeks based upon their lack of techne in comparison to that of the Greeks during Thucydides' time. And of course, to speak of the long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy, you're still speaking of Homer, and in particular, Homer's Odyssey. And we can say very broadly that Homer's Odyssey is about the mind of Odysseus. This paragraph is a continuation of the critique of Homer from the previous paragraph. And so, a provocative way to phrase this, given the opening sentence of Homer's Odyssey, is that Thucydides could very well be suggesting a competition between the mind of Odysseus and the Athenian mind at its height. But we can only speculate that at this point. So we can place a little question mark over that and return to it if he gives us anything more. But just continuing with what he says here, he says the long-delayed return of the Greeks from Troy resulted in great political instability of Greece. But remember what he had just said in the previous paragraph about the reason for the long delay, namely that Homer's Greeks were lacking in techne or technology in order to initially defeat the Trojans in a timely or efficient manner. And so the suggestion here being made by Thucydides is that techne or technology could have prevented this. It could have guarded against the political instability among the Greeks themselves as a result of the Trojan expedition. And we can never forget, politike, the art of politics, is itself a techne. And so it could be the case that there's an art of politics that could have maintained internal stability regardless of how long the Greeks were gone at Troy. But be that as it may, Thucydides points out that after a long period of internal instability, which is to say internal motions, political strife, Greece did find its way toward stability. And he mentions in particular the Athenians and then the Peloponnesians. But we especially always want to keep our eye on the Athenians because remember, Thucydides identified himself as an Athenian in the very opening sentence of the text for a very specific reason. And as we've seen, that particular reason is that Athens, more than anywhere else in Greece, represents Greekness, which is to say, mind revealing itself through techne, such that it's able to master the ceaseless flux of the motions, whether they're non-human in the sense of the ocean or the sea, or whether they're human, which is to say, in this case, internal strife. And all of this is simply to say, the greatness of the mind of the Athenians is utterly unique for Thucydides, even and especially in comparison or in contest with the greatness of the mind of Homer's Greeks, and in particular, Homer's Odysseus. The Athenians, for Thucydides, and unlike the Greeks of Homer, at least according to Thucydides, are able to find stability, which is to say that they have a techne that can at least temporarily master the ceaseless flux of both the human and the non-human motions, so much so that they're able to flourish and even send out colonies, which is to say, to establish empire. And of course, keep in mind, the very possibility of sending out colonies is dependent upon a navy. And it's the technological innovation for naval power that's made possible after that long course of time of political instability from which Greece emerges and enjoys peace or rest that Thucydides now turns to in paragraph 13. And it's in this paragraph that we're going to see the rise of the artisan with his craftsmanship, which is to say his techne, that the entirety of the archaeology has been building up towards ever since Thucydides first introduced us to Minos in his navy, through which mind showed itself capable of mastering the various ceaseless flux, whether human or non-human, through techne or technology, which is to say through an art of politics or technological innovation simply. And so beginning in paragraph 13, this is what Thucydides says. As Greece grew more powerful and became more active than before in the acquisition of wealth, tyrannies were established in the cities in most places, and where previously there were hereditary kingships based on fixed privileges, revenues increased and Greece began to equip itself with navies and came to embrace the element of the sea. The Corinthians are said to have been the first to adopt something like the modern approach to shipbuilding, and it was in Corinth that the triremes were first constructed in Greece. Now, as a sidebar, I'll simply say that what's so important about the triremes is that they were warships with 3 banks of oars, and so they were a major improvement upon the previous style, which is to say the older style of the 50-oared ships, or Pentaconters. And continuing, Thucydides says it was Amynocles, a Corinthian shipwright, apparently built 4 ships for the Samians, and it was about 300 years before the end of this war, in other words, before the end of the Peloponnesian War, that he, Amynocles, went to Samos. And so as a sidebar, we can say that the rise of the artisan begins with Amynocles, the shipwright, which is to say the modern style of shipbuilding. And just continuing, Thucydides says, the earliest sea battle we know about involved the Corinthians against the Corcyraeans, about 260 years before the same date. The Corinthians, with their city established on the isthmus, had from the very earliest times engaged in commerce, while the Greeks of old, both those within the Peloponnese and those outside it, traveled more by land than by sea, and passed through Corinthian territory on their way to see each other. And so the Corinthians became mightily rich, as the ancient poets indicate in calling the place wealthy Corinth. And when the Greeks took to the sea more, the Corinthians acquired ships and cleared the sea of piracy. And by offering a market, both by land and sea, they made their city powerful through the income produced. Now let's just pause and think about how far we've come just in what has been said there. Thucydides began by pointing out that as Greece became more active in the period of peace and rest from the previous paragraph, its accumulation of wealth somehow brings it about that former kingships are replaced by tyrannies. And then there's immediate reference to Greece equipping itself with navies. And with navies, there would seem to be a direct increase of revenues, presumably because of at least 2 things. There's the increase in commerce, and there's also the clearing away of the pirates on the sea. And the piracy is a rather curious phenomenon, because pirates seem to be only indicative of times of great political upheaval, which is to say political motion, stasis. But always with the rise of techne, pirates are the first to go. And so the pirates seem to be representative of the barbarism that Greekness understands itself to not be. But we just need to keep an eye out for that, because there's something about the rise of the pirates that always seems to be indicative of the breakdown of peace and rest, which is to say that they're indicative of the rise of the motions of the ceaseless flux. But be that as it may, we have the rise here of the artisan, the craftsman, namely Amynocles. Amynocles is the one who puts an end to the old-style design and creation of ships, namely the ships that only have 50 oars, the Pentaconters,